I'm really delighted to be here and want to thank Milan and Tomáš for inviting me and Katarzyna for getting me here safely in one piece. And I'm very happy to be with Kalinianska and Pavel Ben and all of you. And I think it's a special place where we are together. I think the world is really changing in us and around us. I was so touched when I came in at the end of the session, and there was a kind of a free-floating compassion and caring and love in the whole room. Something I really did not feel at Hlavní nádraží in Prague when I got on the train. And if we have time later, I would be happy to elaborate on a bold statement that the world is really changing, and I feel it the past 10 years, and it's really moving in a different direction. I think we are at the beginning of major change in paradigm and the way we view the world and perceive it. And we can get into that, but it's a long story, and I want to have enough time to share with you this, which I think is an important part of the change and part of the perspective. Albert Einstein said that we cannot solve the problems in the world by using the same kind of thinking that created the problems. And you know the amount of problems that we have, starting from economic all the way to political and the whole gamut in between. But there is new view, a new perspective, and I think this is a good example, small example. When we deal with emotional difficulties, when we deal with anxiety, depression, alcoholism, post-traumatic stress disorder, we deal with human consciousness. And you've been visiting this morning some of the non-ordinary states, very important part of it. And I think the change really has to start within, inside. I think that's what you obviously are doing. And for that reason, I feel that this is one of the important spots in the world where that step is taking place. The funny thing about the life is that at the moment, you really cannot say anything about the importance of the moment for your life. You can only say it in hindsight, and I've been around long enough to be able to see. But I think that these are the important moments. What you're doing here, focusing on understanding yourself and seeing what kind of changes you need to make. Because that's the only way we can really change the world in a positive way. We change ourselves and see what needs to be done and how it can be done. So, let me tell you about this particular small segment of the story as to what's happening. But I'm going to start with, and I should make it very clear, this is going to be a brief visit into this story. I cannot cover it all. I think you will become clearly aware how major this story is. So, the points I want to touch on today is, first of all, these near-death experiences are unusual ones. What happens is, imagine that somebody dies. For example, most common way is a heart attack. The heart stops, there's no electrical action if you check it. Breathing stops, the brain stops. There's no electrical activity in the brain. So the person is dead. Now, if that lasts for 5 or 6 minutes, you can come back. There's still enough oxygen and one can be resuscitated and come back to life. And it turns out, for example, when this happens during cardiological care, when the cardiologist is taking care of you and it happens on the table, that up to 19 to 20% of people afterwards keep talking about what they experienced, why they were clinically dead, why they were not breathing, the brain was gone, everything was stopping. And of course, some of the things that they tell, and you will see that, they were not very eager to tell everyone because they are, of course, considered crazy. But it turns out that once people started talking about it, they are quite common experiences. The guess is about 4 to 5. North American population, I think there are some statistics, 4 to 5% of people have these experiences. They have car accidents, fell off bicycle, and some bad situation, fell off rocks, whatever. And for some reason they get resuscitated or through some miraculous situation survive. And what they say, and what you will hear the examples, these are clearly not signs of mental illness. These are people who didn't have any problems, don't have any problems. They may change afterwards because of the impact of what they learned during the situation. So it seems that it can happen to virtually anyone who gets into extreme situation. And it's interesting what that experience teaches the people who've gone through that, and what it teaches us who learn the story. And if we take that seriously inside, what kind of impact it has. Losing completely fear of death, not necessarily fear of dying, but certainly fear of death. Seeing differently why we are here for, what the purpose is. And obviously the fact that consciousness, thinking, mental activities continues in a way that can be demonstrated, changes or starts altering our way of thinking about the relationship between the mind and the brain. Because it indicates that individual consciousness in some form can continue even after the body is gone. It's unclear why some people have let's say, if it happens during the cardiological situation, we don't know yet what's the difference between the 20% who come back with the stories and those who don't remember anything from that situation. This is not a new phenomenon. Turns out that Plato, 2,500 years ago, mentions a situation where some soldier died on the battlefield and came back and talked about these experiences, but of course nobody took it seriously. The story has become big about 40-45 years ago, and this is the first book about these stories, where Raymond Moody and if any of you were, it was 1917, I guess, 2017, the 10th person meeting in Prague, where he talked about it. He started philosophy, and that's why he came over Plato, and then turned, I guess philosophy didn't satisfy him enough, so he added medicine to it and became a psychiatrist. And because he knew about this, he started asking, and people started opening up. And once this book came out, of course, people realized that these descriptions of what people have, it's not mental illness, and started sharing it. And this is the most recent book, and certainly if you have an opportunity, it's a book by Bruce Grayson from Virginia University, and he summarizes about 40 years of observations of these kinds. And I thought he would be a very good guy to give you an idea of about 8-9 minutes to describe some of the situations, some of that he encountered in his 45-year exploration of these near-death experiences. Now, let's see whether the technology will work.
Thinking more clearly than ever before, while your heart is stopped and there's no blood going to your brain. Looking down and seeing your body on the operating table and noticing details, unexpected details that your surgeon later verifies for you. Meeting deceased loved ones, family and friends who you thought were still alive. Meeting deceased people who you don't know, but later recognize from family photos. All these are things that happen in some near-death experiences that may have some bearing on the question of whether we survive death of the body, which is our topic for tonight. Is it possible that our consciousness or our mind survives bodily death? There's a wide range of human experiences that suggest this is exactly the case. Near-death experiences occur to us when we're on the threshold of death, and therefore they raise the possibility that they may teach us something about what happens after death. Now, I've been collecting and analyzing near-death experiences for more than 40 years, and I have detailed information about more than 1,000 of these cases. Each one is unique, filtered through the individual's background and personality. But there are some features that they all share in common. And some of these common features have important bearing on the question of whether we survive death and whether some part of us does, and if so, what part is that? One of these features that may have some bearing on the question of survival is enhanced mental functioning, thinking clearer than ever, seeing more vividly, forming more detailed memories, at a time when your brain is seriously impaired. Now, how is that possible? It seems to defy common sense, and yet it happens. James was a 25-year-old nurse who got deeply depressed and decided to end his life. He took some medications from the hospital where he worked, took an overdose, and lay down on his bed expecting to die. He didn't. In fact, he became sicker and sicker, very nauseous with painful stomach cramps, and decided maybe he better call for some help. So he roused himself, tried to get out of bed and get to a telephone. But by this time, the drugs had kicked in and were making him very unsteady. He had trouble standing, trouble walking. Not only that, but the drugs were making him hallucinate, and he was seeing little people all around his bed, making it hard for him to get to the telephone. At this point, he told me, he drew up out of his body and was several feet above his body and behind it, thinking very clearly. And he looked down at his body, staggering around, looking very confused. He remembered being in the body and hallucinating, but from where he was, up above, he couldn't see these little people. Now that convinced James that his mind and his body were not the same thing. And it suggests that I need to think about that also. Are they the same thing? Another feature common to NDEs that makes us question whether we survive is seeing things accurately from some visual perspective not in the body. This too defies common sense. How can you see if you're not in the body? And yet it happens. Al was a 55-year-old truck driver who went to the emergency room with irregular heartbeat. In the emergency room, during diagnostic testing, his heart condition deteriorated rapidly, and he was rushed to the operating room for what eventually became quadruple bypass surgery. In the middle of this operation, he felt himself rising up out of his body and floating weightless above it. He looked down and, to his surprise, saw himself there, lying on the table, with a sheet over his body. And he saw his surgeon down there, looking very perplexed. And as Al described it, his surgeon was flapping his arms as if he was trying to fly. Al didn't understand that. And frankly, I didn't either. I've been working as a doctor for more than 40 years in hospitals. I'd never seen a surgeon do that. I later talked to Al's doctor and asked him about this. And he acknowledged that, yes, he had done that. That where he had trained in his home country to be a surgeon, he had developed this habit. When he walks into the operating room, all scrubbed in, with sterile gloves on, and his residents and interns, his assistants, are starting the operation, he doesn't want to risk touching something not in the sterile field with his clean hands. So he puts them where he knows they won't touch anything sterile. And then he instructs his interns, here, cut over there, pull back over there. So what Al thought was trying to fly was just instructing his assistants on how to do the operation. Now, how did Al know this? How could he see this? This is not an isolated case. A recent survey of more than 100 near-death experiences in which people reported seeing things from an out-of-body perspective found that more than 90% were completely accurate in what they said. Another common feature that people report in NDEs is seeing deceased friends and family. Now, many of us would expect to see deceased loved ones when we die, so that's not so surprising. But sometimes more surprising things happen. For example, people sometimes see deceased loved ones that they thought were still alive. Eddie was a 9-year-old boy who was hospitalized in a coma from meningitis. And he was in a coma for about 36 hours before his fever finally broke. His family were gathered around him by the bedside all night long. And finally, about 3 a.m., he opened his eyes and excitedly told his parents that he had just been to heaven. And he'd seen his dead grandfather and Auntie Rosa and Uncle Lorenzo. And then he said, and I also saw my sister Teresa, who told me I had to come back. Now, Teresa was his older sister who was in college in Vermont. And as far as anyone knew, was perfectly healthy. Later that morning, when his parents went home, they immediately called the college. And they found that Teresa had, in fact, been killed in a car accident just after midnight. How did Eddie know about that? Jack was a 25-year-old electrical engineer who was hospitalized with pneumonia. One day, as his young nurse, Anita, was fluffing up his pillow, she mentioned to him that this weekend was going to be her 21st birthday, and she was going to be gone for a few days, visiting her parents. Shortly after she left, Jack's condition went downhill, and he had trouble breathing. He eventually stopped breathing entirely. He then had a near-death experience in which he saw Nurse Anita. Surprised to see her there, he said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "I've come to fluff your pillow up one more time." And I'd like you to go back and tell my parents that I love them and I'm sorry I wrecked the red sports car. When Jack recovered, he told the nurse about this experience. She started tearing up and left the room immediately. Later, Jack learned that Anita's parents had in fact surprised her with a red sports car for her birthday. And excited to try it out, she raced down the highway and crashed into a concrete barrier, dying instantly. Now, how could Jack know this? How could Eddie know this? How can these things happen? And finally, there are some people in near-death experiences who meet what appear to be deceased people who they don't know. Levi was a 35-year-old man who was born in Holland, who had a cardiac arrest, his heart stopped, and he had a near-death experience, saw his grandmother who had died, and then saw a man who he didn't recognize, but who looked at him very lovingly. He didn't know who this was, didn't know what to make of it, so he didn't talk to anybody about this. 10 years later, when his mother was on her deathbed, she confessed to him that her husband, who had raised Levi as his father, was not, in fact, his biological father. Levi's biological father was, in fact, a Jewish man who had been captured by the Nazis when they came into town, taken to a concentration camp, and never seen again. And then his mother showed Levi a photograph of his father, which he recognized immediately as the man from his near-death experience. So we have in near-death experiences heightened mental thoughts when your brain isn't functioning. We have accurate perceptions from outside the body. We have meeting with deceased loved ones who you didn't know had died. We have deceased meetings with loved ones who you didn't know, period. And we don't have a good physical explanation for this. So all these things should make us think about, is there something about us that survives the bodily death? And if so, what is that thing?
Marvelous.
That's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he describes very well examples of what happened. Now, there's much more to the story, and that for the past 40 years there have been more than 70 studies of near-death experience from all over the world. The best ones, of course, are studies done by cardiologists because they have the body there. They can talk to the person right afterwards. But if I could give you just a brief summary of what else the people describe, I will. And it's important because the story is very consistent. It comes from different descriptions. There's about 4% of people who have a different description and actually talk about hell. And these are people who have been usually brought up in a kind of a strict very religious upbringing with God and hell, two different opposites. But that's an exception. What people, I wanted to say one thing, why I'm stressing the consistency of the message. We are, for the first time in recent years, we are at the point in the history where the language of science, on the one hand, and the language of spirituality and religion, on the other hand, is suddenly coming together. And this could not happen before because there was always the idea, well, we have to test these unusual phenomena through physical means. But you have to, any new discipline has to have its own methods. You cannot in biology assume that you're going to just measure with tape and other technology like you do in physics. And in this area, the experiences from the invisible world, the invisible energies that are all around us here. One of the techniques, obviously, is consistency of people who experience it and come back and can describe it. That certainly is happening in this particular area. So what people say is that, well, keep in mind that while they are there for 5 minutes of earthly time, they are in a zone that is timeless and spaceless. So you can have, I don't know whether you've ever noticed that with dreams, for example. Dreams, you start touching on that area, and sometimes you can have a dream that feels like it's been for weeks or years or decades, and it turns out to be 5 minutes because this is a different dimension. And so when the experience is complete, that usually somebody appears, a friend or mentor who's already passed on and who will help the person to continue. They are brought to what they describe as presence of some being of light. They can use, of course, some different words for that, but that's the most common description. And that your past life is played in front of you, minute after minute. But it's not played just your life, but it's played along with the experiences of people who were in your life, your friends, your family. It's all the emotions, and they describe it not as a judgment, but as a teaching, that you start understand how we have impact on each other, on each other's feelings, positive or negative. And then, of course, it turns out that most people don't want to, the experience is so beautiful, they don't want to come back. But in this situation, they are told the business is not finished. You have to come back. I have not checked this with my brother Stan, but I'm sure he would never object if I mentioned that. When he had stroke 3 years ago, he had the same experience, and of course, he wanted to stay, and he was, no, your business is not finished. You have to come back. There is still more to do. And finally, and the reason why it's difficult to put in words is because we think of ourselves just as separate entities, skin encapsulated egos. But at the other level, you are both distinct soul, but also connected with all the ocean of consciousness. And so it's difficult to put clearly in words. It's a bit ineffable, difficult to put in words. But they describe that then you usually meet with a group of those who passed on, who are somehow connected with you, and you negotiate your next life. There is some kind of a co-creation of what you're gonna take on in the next incarnation. And the difficulty about that is because at that point you are not just a distinct entity but also connected with everything. But that's in a brief as possible presentation the rest of the story that people describe, and of course it raises all kinds of questions of purpose of life, what is given, what is destiny, and whether you have choice. So we can talk. We have some ideas, some information from other studies and observations about that. Essentially, these are, as I said, common experiences. It can happen to any of us, and we have kind of remote healing groups in Ottawa, and so we had some of these discussions, and in every group like this, it turns out there's at least 2 or 3 people who had near-death experience. But they often haven't talked about it to anybody else. It happened in exceptional circumstances. Some people, even physicians who experience this, seem to spend much more time than 5 minutes. Sometimes it feels it could be an element of miracle. There's a physician who had an accident, boating accident, on kayak, and it seems like she was underwater for about 15 minutes. And how is it possible she came out? That's at the beginning of exploring these phenomena. Probably the most fascinating phenomenon in this is the impact that it has on the people who had the experience. As I said, they lose fear of death. They get a different feeling for what their purpose, what their task is in life. They make it becomes much easier. They describe that it's much easier to live in the moment. I think most of our are here because we spend a lot of time kind of thinking about the past and what did we wrong and what we could have done better and what's going to go wrong in the future. But the life is really here in the moment, and the story is people say that once you have this experience, it's much easier to live right in the moment where the real life is. I've said that. They live in the present moment. The interesting thing is, people now tell me that once they think about it and fully accept it, they can make some changes in their own life as well, simply by knowing this situation. And keep in mind that the whole thing is set up in such a way, it's like the ultimate intelligence plays kind of hide and seek with us in the same sense that we search for what's on the other side and start touching on it and believing, and of course the next thing we start doubting, well, is it, maybe I'm just making this up, maybe. Because if it did not go this way, if we became very clear that this is the way it is, it would be difficult for life to continue for most population in the way it does. And it, of course, dramatically changes our thinking about the relationship between mind and brains, and that's something I'm spending a lot of time now exploring that, because it's interesting how these observations and experiments by cardiologists, how that fits with what we know about neurobiology and what we know about neurobiology of depression and anxiety and those conditions. And of course, the question of continuity of condition after our body is gone. And we don't know who of the people who had this near-death experience, who come back with the reports and who do not. So, I think I talked long enough.
No.
Oh, maybe just last thing. Let me just say what I think, what are the lessons from this, at least I would take. Human consciousness clearly goes on. Now, it depends how you define yourself. Do you define yourself as the body, or do you define yourself as soul, or do you define yourself as, I think one should define yourself from this, which is body and soul. We can learn about the functioning of human mind beyond the veil from these congruent reports now of thousands and thousands of people who came back. They can certainly have a profound impact on us. They can change how we live. One can become more clear about what the priorities in life really are. It certainly reduces, the experience is reduced in the fear of death. Brain alone, in my opinion, based on these facts and a bunch of other facts, whether you take psi phenomena, the hugely well documented existence of telepathy, remote viewing, remote healing, some data from psychokinesis, that all suggests that there is more to human consciousness than just brain. And if you take seriously what the people come and they come back, then we in some way seem to be co-creators of our life. And my feeling is that the important lesson from this is that we are really at the beginning of a new era in exploring human consciousness. What actually is happening out there? What happens when we are one, and how the distinct entities continue functioning in some way. That all needs to be, I think, explored. We're just getting a taste of a completely new way of looking at things. Thank you.